A single reinforced bicycle, its bamboo-braced frame groaning under 300 kilograms of rice, disappeared into the mountain mist as its pusher began another 20-kilometer night march toward the war. This is the story of the most audacious supply line in military history, a network that would stretch 16,000 kilometers through some of the world's most hostile terrain, defy the greatest bombing campaign ever unleashed, and ultimately decide the fate of Southeast Asia. The Ho Chi Minh Trail wasn't just a road. It was the circulatory system of revolution, pumping life into a war that America believed it could strangle from the air. On May 19, 1959, in the humid corridors of Hanoi's military headquarters, Communist Party officials gathered around maps that would reshape the geography of war. The scent of strong Vietnamese coffee mixed with cigarette smoke, as General Vo Nguyen Giap's staff outlined an impossible proposition: carve a secret highway through the Annamite Cordillera, threading it across neutral Laos to avoid South Vietnamese army outposts, and use it to funnel revolution southward. They called it Group 559, named for the fifth month of 59, and tasked it with opening the Truong Son strategic supply route. Americans would eventually know it by a different name, the Ho Chi Minh Trail. But to the thousands who would build it, guard it, and die for it, Truong Son meant something deeper. The name evoked the long mountain range itself, and soldiers would sing as they marched, Kse Dok Truong Son Di Ku Nuoc, cut along Truong Son to save the nation. The early route was nothing more than elephant paths and hunting trails worn smooth by centuries of Montagnard feet. By late 1960, it threaded just over 100 kilometers through jungles so dense that botanists had never catalogued half the species growing there. The air hung thick with the smell of rotting vegetation and the metallic tang of mountain streams. Leeches, locals called the largest ones, tiger leeches, dropped from branches onto anyone foolish enough to brush the undergrowth. But what began as footpaths would not remain so. By 1965, those same trails had been widened into truck-worthy roads, graded by hand with nothing but mattocks and shovels. The sound of metal striking stone echoed through valleys that had known only bird calls for millennia. Workers' hands bled through rags wrapped around wooden handles, but the work never stopped. The mountain passes at Mu Jia and Ban Karai became the trail's beating heart key gateways that sat within 5 to 15 kilometers of the Laos border. Here, the smell of diesel fuel began to mingle with jungle rot as the first trucks rumbled through. Soviet Zil 157 seconds, and Chinese Jifang copies carried 2 to 3 tons, each upgrades that would challenge a mountain goat, their engines straining in low gear as drivers navigated switchbacks carved from living rock. Yet even as the first supply trucks rolled south, American reconnaissance planes were already circling overhead like patient vultures. The bombing would begin in earnest by 1966, turning those mountain passes into daily targets. But Group 559's planners had anticipated this. They weren't building a road, they were building a living organism that could heal itself faster than bombs could wound it. The genius lay not in the trail's strength, but in its adaptability. Like water finding its way downhill, the supply route would flow around obstacles, split into tributaries, and reconvene downstream. When bombs cratered the main highway, youth shock brigades, many just 16 to 22 years old, would appear like ghosts in the pre-dawn darkness, clearing landslides in 6 to 12 hours and opening bypass routes that mapmakers would never see. Can you imagine volunteering for such work, knowing that every night might bring the roar of jet engines and the whistle of falling bombs? The trail's builders understood something that American strategists would take years to grasp. This wasn't infrastructure that could be destroyed from the air. This was revolution made manifest in mud and bamboo, a testament to what human ingenuity could accomplish when survival itself was at stake, and they were just getting started. By 1966, Group 559 controlled base areas deep in Laotian territory logistics hubs, designated by numbers like 604, 611, and 609. These weren't mere truck stops. They were underground cities complete with repair shops where mechanics straightened leaf springs with charcoal forges, field hospitals where medics performed surgery by lamplight, and anti-aircraft belts bristling with 12.7mm and 37mm guns whose crews counted tracers in 2 to 3 second bursts to conserve their precious ammunition loads of 200 to 400 rounds. But what would happen when American bombing escalated from harassment to Holocaust, when 2 million tons of ordnance began falling on a supply route that officially didn't exist? The porter kept his father's watch ticking by pressing it against his chest each night, never knowing that this simple act of sentiment would save his life when he learned to time the 3-minute gaps between B-52 bombing waves. This was how the trail truly functioned, not through grand strategy or sophisticated logistics, but through thousands of individual acts of ingenuity born from desperation. As infiltration surged after 1965, tens of thousands of People's Army of Vietnam troops began marching south annually, organized into 30 to 50-man groups spaced 100 to 300 meters apart, like beads on an invisible string stretching through the jungle. At the Hanoi and Vinh railheads, the transformation from civilian to shadow began. Young men and women, many barely out of their teens, shouldered K-packs weighing 25 to 40 kilograms and began their journey into a world where survival depended on reading the sky like scripture. They learned to differentiate between the distant whine of F-4 Phantoms and the deeper rumble of propeller-driven A-1 Sky Raiders by sound alone, to freeze at the first glint of sunlight off aircraft aluminum, and to measure their lives in the gaps between bombing runs. The bicycles became legendary, reinforced frames braced with bamboo and steel that could haul 200 to 300 kilograms of rice, while their pushers walked 20 to 30 kilometers per night over terrain that would challenge a mule. But it was the small innovations that kept the trail alive. Cat-eye convoy lights with slit-mast headlights that allowed trucks to crawl forward at 10 to 15 kilometers per hour on moonless nights, and the daily ritual of chopping and replanting foliage so that Soviet ZIL 130 seconds and Chinese Jiefang trucks looked like moving bushes from above. Fresh-cut leaves were wired to roofs and hoods each morning, a camouflage that had to be perfect because American photo interpreters studied every shadow with the intensity of scholars parsing ancient texts. The slightest geometric line, the faintest tire track, could bring down a rain of 500-pound bombs within hours. The monsoon ruled everything. May through October, laterite clay turned into red glue that could trap a fully loaded truck for days. Porters smeared lamp oil on their calves to deter leeches, but the tiger leech's thumb-thick bloodsuckers still managed to slip under leggings and swell obscenely by dawn. November through April brought the dry season, when dust turned tongues orange and men chewed green guava leaves to cut the grit and the persistent taste of diesel fuel that seemed to coat everything. Meals consisted of 300 grams of rice, stretched with wild greens, bananas, and roasted bamboo shoots. Canvas hammocks hung under palm-thatched lean-tos while men and women shared watches in 2-hour rotations, listening for the distant turbofan whine that meant death was approaching at 600 miles per hour. Tin cups doubled as signal mirrors. 1 flash meant plane, 2 helicopter, 3 flare. Then everything froze under ponchos mottled with mud. The trail developed its own culture, its own language of survival. Trung Sun sap, a mixture of diesel, sweat, and crushed leaves, became the signature scent of bivouacs, mixing with wood smoke and the sweet rot of monsoon humus. Veterans learned to identify different types of aircraft by the sound of their engines, different types of bombs by their whistle, and different types of death by the color of the flash on the horizon. But perhaps nothing captured the trail's spirit better than the decoy operations. When American sensors detected truck movement along a particular route, entire convoys might spend hours positioning a single bamboo frame woven to look like a vehicle from above. The real trucks would idle 200 meters away under a waterfall's spray while F-4 Phantoms unleashed their ordnance on empty jungle, their pilots never knowing they'd been outwitted by farmers with hand tools and infinite patience. The fuel pipeline, begun in 1968, represented perhaps the trail's greatest engineering achievement. Snaking over 1,000 kilometers by 1972, it lifted 200 to over 1,000 tons of gasoline and diesel south each month, invisible under a carpet of leaf litter that was replanted daily. Crews bled off liters into Coca-Cola bottles for motorbikes and cooking stoves, a black market economy that turned war surplus into the currency of survival. Medical stations at Base Area 604 treated the endless parade of tropical diseases that claimed more lives than bombs ever would. Malaria rates of 30 to 40% during wet season were considered normal among trail workers. Medics staged transfusions with reused glass bottles boiled nightly over charcoal fires, and a 500-milliliter blood donation earned 2 extra ladles of rice and a precious cigarette. What drove these people to endure such conditions, to rebuild roads faster than bombs could destroy them? The answer lay not in ideology alone, but in the peculiar mathematics of asymmetric warfare. While American strategists calculated tonnage dropped and sorties flown, trail veterans measured success differently, in the number of friends who reached the Southern Front alive. in the tons of rice that slipped past sensors, in the small victories that accumulated like grains of sand until they buried the enemy's best-laid plans. As youth shock brigades cleared another landslide in the pre-dawn darkness, their shovels striking stone in rhythm with songs about home and liberation, a more fundamental question was emerging in the Pentagon's corridors of power. A squad boiled stream water in an intact cluster bomblet shell after gutting the explosive enemy metal cooking rice for liberation, one diary noted with grim satisfaction. Between 1964 and 1973, American aircraft flew hundreds of thousands of sorties over Laos, transforming the neutral kingdom into the most heavily bombed country per capita in human history. An estimated 2 million tons of ordnance fell on the trail region, more than the United States dropped on Germany and Japan combined during World War II. Yet the trucks kept rolling, the bicycles kept moving, and the revolution kept flowing south like a river that refused to be dammed. The bombing followed patterns that trail veterans learned to read like weather. B-52 arc-light strikes arrived in 3-plane cells, their approach so high that the first warning was often the ground rolling beneath your feet for 15 to 20 seconds after impact. The bombers flew in boxes, precise geometric patterns that showered destruction across grids, measured in kilometers. Experienced porters learned to time these patterns, using their father's watches or counting heartbeats to gauge the 3-minute gaps between waves when a man could run from one shelter to another. The forest itself became a participant in this deadly dance. After arc-light strikes, the jungle fell silent except for the patter of leaves and stunned cicadas dropping from shattered branches. Then came the secondary sounds, the groans of wounded trees, the splash of crater lakes filling with monsoon rain, and eventually always the scrape of shovels as work crews emerged to restore what had been destroyed. American pilots, flying at altitudes where the jungle looked like green carpet, could never grasp the human dimension of their targets. Down in that carpet, sapper teams crawled ahead of every convoy, probing with bamboo poles tipped with nails to tickle the soil for thin-skinned BLU-26 cluster bomblets. These yellow tennis ball-sized killers were designed to maim rather than destroy, their fragments turning a man's legs to hamburger while leaving him conscious enough to scream for medics who might not come. The trail's defenders developed countermeasures, born from desperation and dark humor. Anti-sensor teams heated buckets of urine and fish sauce to confuse chemical sniffers, creating false scent trails that lured expensive sensors into empty ravines. Decoy operations reached theatrical heights. Entire squads might spend days constructing fake truck parks complete with tire tracks leading nowhere, while the real convoys sheltered under waterfalls that masked their heat signatures from infrared detectors. But it was the human cost that truly defined this period. Field hospitals reported malaria rates climbing past 40% during wet seasons, with dysentery and shrapnel wounds filling the remaining beds. Medical units operated with supplies that would horrify modern doctors: reused glass bottles for transfusions, surgical instruments sterilized in boiling stream water, and morphine, so scarce that rice wine served as the primary anesthetic for emergency amputations. The pipeline crews faced perhaps the most dangerous work of all. The fuel line that began in 1968 had to cross mountain saddles where booster pumps were needed every 40 to 60 kilometers. These stations became prime targets for American interdiction strikes, and crews learned to sleep in shifts with one ear always tuned to the sky. When bombs severed the line, repair teams would splice sections together using improvised gaskets cut from tire inner tubes, often working by touch in complete darkness, while fuel vapors made every spark potentially fatal. Convoy operations developed their own brutal mathematics. Truck spacing of 500 to 1,000 meters at night meant that if flares popped, drivers had 10 seconds to kill engines and flip camouflage tarps before shadows betrayed their positions. The phrase, "loud trucks die," became gospel. Drivers coasted in low gear, and shouting was banned within a kilometer of known choke points, where sound could carry up canyon walls to listening posts. Rain drums on ponchos became an improvised timepiece when watches failed. Veterans learned to count 600 drops per minute to pace marches, turning the monsoon's endless percussion into a survival tool. But the rain brought its own horrors: canvas hammocks that never dried, boots that rotted off feet in weeks, and the constant threat of flash floods that could sweep away entire convoys in valleys that had been bone dry at sunset. The camouflage schools that sprouted along the trail taught lessons that no military academy ever imagined. Students learned shadow reading. If your truck's shadow fell in a straight line, you were on a straight road and visible from above. They practiced the daily ritual of replacing foliage that would wilt and change color under observation, and mastered the art of making supply dumps invisible by scattering them in patterns that mimicked natural forest debris. One driver discovered that wedging a live python across his dashboard made checkpoint inspections considerably. Shorter military police waved the snake truck through without asking questions. Such innovations flourished in an environment where creativity often meant the difference between reaching your destination and becoming a crater in the jungle floor. Repair shops became temples to improvisation, their mechanics able to rebuild a ZIL transmission from 3 donor vehicles using tools forged from bomb fragments. Organ banks, scrap piles sorted by thread pitch and bolt length grew beside every major depot, testament to the trail's philosophy that nothing useful could be wasted, not even the enemy's ordnance. A single question haunted American strategists as sortie reports climbed into the hundreds of thousands. How could an enemy with no air force, no navy, and Stone Age logistics continue to move supplies through the most concentrated bombing campaign in history? The answer lay scattered across 16,000 kilometers of roads and tracks, hidden in bypasses and fords and parking shelves carved into hillsides, embodied in teenagers who could rebuild a bombed bridge before dawn, and grandmothers who could strip a downed aircraft for useful metal while its wreckage still smoked. An elephant hired from a Lao village ferried a ZIL's engine block 600 kilograms of Soviet steel across a swamp when the only log bridge collapsed, its mahout singing traditional songs while American jets screamed overhead. By 1966, the trail had evolved beyond simple supply routes into something unprecedented in military history, a subterranean nation stretching across 3 countries, complete with its own infrastructure, culture, and hidden cities that existed entirely beneath the jungle canopy. Base areas 604, 611, and 609 inches. Laos had grown into logistics hubs that rivaled anything the Americans had built in South Vietnam, except these installations were designed to be invisible from above. At Base Area 604, the largest of these underground complexes, workshops hummed with activity 24 hours a day. The smell of welding torches mixed with the medicinal tang of field hospitals where surgeons operated by kerosene lamplight, their hands steady despite the distant rumble of B-52 seconds circling like mechanical vultures. Here, mechanics performed miracles that would have impressed Detroit engineers, straightening leaf springs with charcoal forges and sledgehammers, rebuilding transmissions from cannibalized parts, and fashioning tire sandals dep-lope from blown truck tires in minutes. The workshops operated under strict noise discipline. Hammers were wrapped in cloth, engines were test-run inside sound baffles woven from palm fronds, and workers communicated through hand signals developed specifically for the trail. The phrase "loud trucks die" had evolved into an entire philosophy of industrial silence, where the clank of metal on metal could mean the difference between survival and sudden obliteration from above. Rivers like the Saipan and Sai-Kong became engineering challenges that spawned their own solutions. Pontoon bridges sat no higher than a man's chest, low-slung spans that were assembled before dawn and dismantled at first light if observation aircraft had been spotted. These bridges had to support fully loaded trucks while remaining invisible to aerial reconnaissance, a paradox solved through techniques borrowed from stage magic. Bridges that looked like log jams from above but could bear 3 tons of Soviet steel below. The fuel pipeline represented perhaps the trail's greatest technical achievement. Beginning in 1968, it eventually snaked over 1,000 kilometers by 1972, lifting hundreds of tons of gasoline and diesel south each month through terrain that would challenge modern engineers. Booster pumps, camouflaged as natural rock formations, lifted fuel over mountain saddles every 40 to 60 kilometers. Crews bled off precious liters into Coca-Cola bottles for motorbikes and field stoves, creating a black market economy where American soft drink containers became the currency of war. The pipeline's invisibility was maintained through obsessive attention to detail. Every section was buried under at least 2 meters of soil and leaf litter that had to be replaced daily to match surrounding vegetation. Repair crews developed techniques for splicing breaks underwater, working by touch in murky streams while wearing improvised diving masks cut from truck inner tubes. But it was in the ASO sector that trail engineering reached its most sophisticated expression. Here, units hid in earth houses, elaborate dugouts roofed with double log decks and 50 to 80 centimeters of soil that remained cool as cellars even during the blazing midday heat. These underground complexes included sleeping quarters, mess halls, ammunition storage, and command centers connected by tunnels that allowed movement without exposure to aerial observation. The construction techniques had been refined through bitter experience. early dugouts had collapsed under bombing, burying their occupants alive. Veterans learned to recognize the sound of different explosives, the sharp crack of conventional bombs versus the deeper rumble of delayed fuse penetrators designed to collapse bunkers. They developed construction standards that could withstand near misses from 500-pound bombs, using interlocking log frameworks that distributed blast pressure across multiple support points. Camouflage evolved from art to science. Bulldozers, supplied by Chinese allies, worked exclusively under tarps, their crews memorizing blade angles by touch to push spoil into nets so no fresh dirt would glint in aerial photographs. One-night roads might be graded at dusk, used by midnight convoys, and ploughed back into apparent random terrain by dawn, leaving no straight lines for photo interpreters to detect. Bamboo, smoke traps, wet fronds arranged over trench stoves, bled cooking smoke sideways, so that heat columns visible to infrared sensors were broken into cool, ragged plumes that resembled natural forest transpiration. These devices required constant adjustment as wind patterns shifted, turning meal preparation into a complex choreography of survival. The trail's radio networks operated under equally stringent constraints. Low-power sets transmitted messages timed to last under 20 seconds, with operators shifting positions every 2 to 3 hours to avoid triangulation by American direction-finding equipment. Code words evolved daily. Buffalo might mean convoy today and airstrike tomorrow, keeping communications secure through constant linguistic mutation. Medical facilities within these base areas treated casualties that never appeared in official statistics. Malaria, dysentery, and infected leech bites filled beds alongside shrapnel wounds and burns from fuel explosions. Field newspapers, 2 to 4 mimeograph pages, reported unit achievements and featured cartoon panels mocking Den Pin Me American flares as clumsy sky ghosts that revealed more about American tactics than Vietnamese. Positions. The human cost of maintaining these installations was measured in more than casualties. Workers developed their own folklore, their own superstitions born from living underground. Before difficult passes, squads poured capfuls of rice liquor to forest spirits. Whistling at night was absolutely forbidden. It calls wind and plains, according to trail mythology that mixed ancient animism with modern air defense. At night, luminous fungus growing on rotting logs became waymarks for supply columns. Scouts nicknamed particular landmarks. A glowing stump 8 kilometers north of Ban Karai became known as the Lantern, visible from several hundred meters and serving as a navigation point for bicycle columns moving in complete darkness. Culture traveled these underground highways alongside ammunition and rice. Guitars fashioned from ammunition crates provided entertainment during the endless waiting between bombing runs. Mouth harps carved from truck springs offered music that couldn't be heard above ground, and nightly Venget poetry sessions about home, rain, and the smell of rice husks maintained morale in conditions that would have broken armies with less cohesive cultures. Yet even as these underground cities grew more sophisticated, a new threat was emerging from American research laboratories, sensors that could detect not just movement and sound, but the chemical signatures of human presence itself. A survivor recalled waking buried to the neck by a near miss, only his leaf hat's tip showing above the churned earth. Friends found him by the wet shine of that single piece of woven palm frond. By 1968, the conflict along the Ho Chi Minh Trail had evolved into something unprecedented in military history. A war fought not just with bombs and bullets, but with chemistry, electronics, and the very sense that marked human presence in the jungle. American scientists had developed sensors so sophisticated they could detect the ammonia in human urine from aircraft flying at 10,000 feet, turning the ancient act of relieving oneself into a potentially fatal security breach. The enemy they faced was no longer just Vietnamese ingenuity, but American technology that seemed to possess supernatural powers of detection. Air-dropped acoubios, acoustic sensors, disguised as twigs, could pick up the sound of truck engines from miles away. Seismic sensors buried along known routes measured the vibrations of footsteps and bicycle wheels. Chemical sniffers analyzed air samples for traces of diesel fuel, cooking smoke, and the metabolic byproducts of large groups of humans living in close proximity. But if American technology was sophisticated, Vietnamese countermeasures were diabolical in their simplicity. Anti-sensor teams heated buckets of urine and rotting fish sauce to temperatures that would trigger chemical detectors, then carried these reeking decoys along false trails that led surveillance aircraft into empty valleys. The sensors, faithfully reporting massive human presence, would vector bombing strikes onto uninhabited jungle while real convoys moved through corridors scrubbed clean of any detectable scent. the trail's defenders learned to think like the machines hunting them. Acoustic sensors detected sound, so repair crews wrapped hammers in layers of cloth and communicated through hand signals. Seismic sensors measured vibrations, so work parties synchronized their movements to natural rhythms: the patter of rain, the sway of trees in wind, the scurrying of forest animals that continued their lives oblivious to the technological war raging overhead. Chemical sensors proved the most challenging to defeat. Human beings leaked scent signatures through every pore: the ammonia of sweat, the ketones of ketosis during food shortages, the distinct chemical markers of different ethnic groups' diets. Vietnamese technicians, working with equipment salvaged from downed aircraft, reverse-engineered sensor capabilities, and developed countermeasures that turned American technology against itself. False scent trails became an art form. Teams would drag rags soaked in diesel fuel and human waste along paths that led nowhere, creating sensor readings that suggested major supply routes through terrain too steep for bicycles and too swampy for trucks. Meanwhile, real convoys moved through areas scrubbed with lime and ash, their exhaust pipes fitted with catalytic chambers that broke down telltale hydrocarbons before they could reach enemy sensors. The pipeline operations required the most sophisticated deception measures. Fuel vapors were impossible to mask completely. So, engineers created false pipeline routes, using buried bamboo tubes filled with kerosene and alcohol that would trigger sensors while producing signatures too weak to indicate major fuel transport. The real pipeline, meanwhile, was ventilated through networks of bamboo tubes that dispersed vapors across hundreds of square meters, diluting them below sensor thresholds. Convoy spacing evolved into a mathematical discipline. Trucks traveled 500 to 1,000 meters apart at night, far enough that if flares popped, drivers could kill engines and deploy camouflage tarps within 10 seconds without revealing the positions of vehicles ahead or behind. If sensors detected one truck, bombing strikes would create an empty road, while the rest of the convoy continued undetected. The repair shops developed their own techniques for avoiding detection. Welding was done inside, underground chambers vented through long bamboo tubes that dispersed metallic vapors. Paint fumes from vehicle maintenance were absorbed into charcoal filters made from burned rice hulls. Even the metal filings from machining operations were collected and buried in lead-lined containers to prevent chemical detection. Enemy sensors plucked from crash sites were studied with the intensity that medieval scholars brought to religious texts. Vietnamese technicians dissected every component, mapping frequency responses and sensitivity thresholds. They discovered that sensors could be fooled by natural phenomena. Waterfalls, masked acoustic signatures, magnetic rock formations, confused electronic equipment, and certain atmospheric conditions created false chemical readings. The most audacious countermeasure involved relocating captured sensors near waterfalls and animal trails. False positives from these redeployed devices wasted thousands of sorties, vectoring strikes onto empty coordinates, while real targets moved through corridors that appeared clean on American sensor networks. But the psychological warfare cut both directions. Trail workers developed their own superstitions around American technology that seemed to possess almost mystical powers of detection. Some believed that metal dental fillings could be detected from aircraft, leading to a black market in tooth extraction. Others were convinced that certain fabrics reflected infrared signatures differently, spawning elaborate rituals around clothing, selection, and laundry techniques. The night belonged to both hunter and hunted in ways that daylight never did. Luminous fungus growing on rotting logs became waymarks for supply columns, moving in complete darkness, their soft glow invisible to aircraft but sufficient for human navigation. Convoy lights were reduced to thin slits that cast just enough illumination to follow tire tracks while remaining undetectable from above. Radio discipline reached almost monastic levels of austerity. Messages were compressed into bursts lasting under 20 seconds. Operators changed frequencies according to schedules derived from natural phenomena, phases of the moon, tidal patterns, even the breeding cycles of forest insects. Code words evolved daily through systems so complex that capturing equipment yielded little useful intelligence. The fuel tins themselves became instruments of deception. 20-liter containers were wrapped in banana leaves not just to muffle the telltale clink of metal on metal, but to absorb chemical signatures that might leak through imperfect seals. Standard loads, 2 cans per porter, 40 kilograms total, were calculated to remain below sensor thresholds while still maintaining supply flow rates. As 1969 approached, American strategists faced a disturbing realization: Their most sophisticated surveillance technology was being systematically defeated by an enemy that seemed to understand electronic warfare better than the engineers who designed the systems. The Trail was no longer just surviving the most intensive bombing campaign in history. It was learning to make that technology serve Vietnamese purposes, turning American sensors into tools of misdirection that protected the very supply routes they were designed to destroy. A comrade marked each lost friend on his rifle stock by 1971. 17 notches ran like a ladder up the wooden grip, and he kept that rifle after the war ended. By 1968 through 69, the Trail had reached a throughput measured in thousands of tons per dry season, transforming from a guerrilla supply line into a strategic highway capable of moving heavy artillery, tanks, and the massive quantities of ammunition required for conventional warfare. The Tet Offensive had demonstrated that the revolution could strike anywhere in South Vietnam simultaneously, but it had also revealed the cost of such operations. The Trail would need to carry not just rice and small arms, but the heavy weapons of modern warfare. The 4-inch pipeline had become the circulatory system of this transformation. Cresting mountain saddles with booster pumps disguised as natural rock formations, it delivered hundreds of tons of fuel monthly to forward positions where Soviet T-54 tanks and Chinese Type 59 seconds waited in carefully camouflaged motor pools. Crews bled off precious liters into Coca-Cola bottles for field use, but the bulk of the flow was destined for operations that would require mechanized mobility on a scale previously unimaginable. Camouflage schools along the Trail had evolved into sophisticated training centers where students learned techniques that bordered on theater. Shadow reading became a core curriculum. If your vehicle's shadow fell in a straight line, you were on a straight road and vulnerable to aerial detection. Students practiced the daily ritual of replacing wilting foliage with fresh-cut branches, learning to recognize which leaves would maintain color longest and which would curl in ways that revealed artificial placement. The repair infrastructure had grown into an industrial network that rivaled anything in conventional warfare. Mechanics maintained organ banks, meticulously sorted collections of spare parts organized by thread pitch and bolt length, where a ZIL gearbox might be reborn from components cannibalized from 3 donor vehicles. These workshops operated under tarps that filtered the distinctive blue glow of welding torches, making them invisible to infrared sensors, while maintaining 24-hour production schedules. Soviet ZIL trucks and Chinese Jiefang copies had become the workhorses of an operation that moved with the precision of a Swiss watch, despite operating in conditions that would challenge modern logistics. Each truck carried 2 to 3 tons upgrades that would challenge mountain goats, their engines modified with additional cooling systems and low-pressure tires that distributed weight across soft surfaces while leaving tire tracks that looked like natural erosion patterns from above. After 1970, trucks began appearing with tree trunks lashed to their bumpers, log cows, that pushed aside unexploded cluster bombs while feeling for larger ordnance that could destroy an entire convoy. These improvised mine detectors were manned by volunteers who understood that their job description included a high probability of sudden vaporization, yet the positions never went unfilled. The dust of dry season had become a tactical consideration. November through April, laterite clay baked into choking powder that turned tongues orange and coated everything in a film that could be detected by chemical sensors. Men learned to chew green guava leaves to cut the grit and mask the persistent taste of diesel fuel, while mechanics developed techniques for sealing engine compartments against the abrasive dust that could destroy bearings in days. Road construction had evolved into a form of military art. Bulldozers worked exclusively at night under sound-dampening tarps, their operators memorizing blade angles by touch to avoid creating the geometric patterns that would show up in aerial reconnaissance. One-night roads might be graded at dusk, used by midnight convoys, and deliberately churned back into apparent randomness by dawn, erasing all evidence of organized activity before the morning's photo flights. But it was the human cost that truly defined this period. Casualties among Group 559 and the youth shock brigades numbered in the tens of thousands, though historians debate exact figures due to the dispersed nature of operations and Laotian government secrecy that persists decades after the war's end. What is certain is that entire villages' worth of young people disappeared into the jungle and never returned, their graves marked only by the notches carved into rifle stocks by surviving comrades. Rations had improved before major campaigns. 600 grams of rice, a tin of meat, 20 grams of salt, 10 cigarettes. But even these increased supplies were supplemented by whatever could be foraged from the forest. Frogs and field crabs found their way into mess pots despite regulations, and the ability to identify edible plants became as important as knowing how to field strip an AK-47. Medical stations continued to operate under conditions that would horrify modern doctors. Field hospitals performed surgery with instruments sterilized in boiling stream water, using rice wine as anesthetic, and reused glass bottles for blood transfusions. A 500 milliliter blood donation earned 2 extra ladles of rice and a cigarette currency in an economy where everything had value because nothing could be wasted. By 1972, the trail had achieved something that American strategists had declared impossible. People's Army of Vietnam forces were moving tanks and 130 mm artillery pieces along improved laterite roads into Quang Tri province. The supply route that had begun as bicycle paths and elephant trails now supported the movement of heavy armor, transforming the tactical balance in ways that would make conventional victory possible. The pipeline reached its peak capacity during this period, moving over 1,000 tons of fuel monthly through a network that stretched over terrain where engineers had said such construction was impossible. Booster stations camouflaged as natural rock formations pumped fuel over mountain passes that American strategists had considered impenetrable barriers to mechanized warfare. Letters from home still took 30 to 60 days to reach forward positions, arriving with mold threads like white hair from the humid journey through jungle postal networks. Soldiers would sniff these letters for the faint scent of home cooking fires, incense from family altars, the particular dust of village streets that connected them to a world beyond the endless cycle of bombing and rebuilding. Field newspapers continued to report unit achievements and mock American tactics, but the tone had shifted. The cartoons still featured Den Pin Me, clumsy American flares as ghostly figures stumbling through the forest. But there was a new confidence in the reporting, a sense that victory was no longer a distant aspiration, but an approaching reality. As 1973 began, American bombing in Laos was finally beginning to ebb, but the trail's transformation was already complete. After January 1973, bombing in Laos ebbed to sporadic harassment raids, and work crews began widening roads to 6 to 8 meters in places broad enough for tank transporters and the heavy equipment of conventional warfare. The Paris Peace Accords had officially ended American involvement in Vietnam, but along the trail the work of revolution continued with renewed intensity. What had been a clandestine supply network operating under constant bombardment was transforming into the logistical backbone of a conventional military campaign designed to reunify Vietnam under communist rule. The widened roads carried a different kind of traffic now. Soviet T-54 tanks rumbled south on Chinese-built transporters, their crews hidden under tarps that made the deadly cargo look like shipments of lumber or construction materials. 130 mm artillery pieces, guns capable of reducing South Vietnamese fire bases to rubble, moved in convoys protected by anti-aircraft batteries that no longer bothered with elaborate camouflage. The 4-inch pipeline reached its maximum capacity during this period, pumping over 1,000 tons of fuel monthly through a network that American engineers had declared impossible to construct. Booster stations disguised as natural rock formations worked around the clock, their operators monitoring pressure gauges by lamplight while listening for the increasingly rare sound of American aircraft overhead. Youth shock brigades, many of whom had spent their entire adolescence rebuilding bombed roads, found themselves constructing permanent infrastructure for the first time. Concrete bridges replaced the low-slung pontoon spans that had been assembled and dismantled nightly for years. Proper drainage systems carried monsoon runoff away from road surfaces that were being built to last decades, not just survive the next bombing run. The repair shops had evolved into industrial complexes that rivaled anything in North Vietnam's conventional economy. Mechanics who had learned their trade rebuilding engines from bomb fragments now worked with proper tools and adequate lighting, turning out repaired vehicles at rates that would have impressed Detroit assembly lines. The organ banks of salvaged parts had grown into warehouses, where entire vehicles could be assembled from components cannibalized from dozens of donors. But perhaps the most significant change was psychological. Trail veterans who had spent years moving in 30 to 50-man groups spaced hundreds of meters apart now found themselves part of conventional military formations moving in daylight. The nighttime world of whispered conversations and frozen silence when flares popped was giving way to the organized chaos of mechanized warfare. Radio discipline relaxed as American direction-finding capabilities diminished. Messages that had once been compressed into 20-second bursts now carried detailed coordination for complex operations involving hundreds of vehicles and thousands of personnel. The code words that had evolved daily for years began to stabilize into standard military terminology as the need for absolute secrecy decreased. Medical facilities upgraded from field hospitals using reused glass bottles to proper surgical suites with adequate supplies, and trained personnel transferred from North Vietnamese military hospitals. Malaria rates began dropping as units spent less time hiding in swamps and more time on improved roads where drainage reduced mosquito breeding grounds. The pipeline crews, who had worked for years under conditions that would challenge oilfield professionals, found themselves operating a fuel distribution network that supplied not just individual vehicles and cooking stoves, but entire armored divisions preparing for conventional offensive operations. Fuel that had once been bled off into Coca-Cola bottles for individual use was now measured in thousands of gallons per day. Cultural changes followed logistical improvements. The guitars, fashioned from ammunition crates and mouth harps, carved from truck springs, were joined by proper instruments shipped south along supply lines that could now carry non-essential cargo. The nightly poetry sessions about home and rain evolved into organized entertainment programs designed to maintain morale during the transition from guerrilla to conventional warfare. Letters from home still took weeks to reach their destinations, but the postal network had become reliable enough that families could plan around delivery schedules. The mold-threaded letters that soldiers had sniffed for traces of home were replaced by correspondence that arrived in readable condition, carrying news of peace negotiations and reconstruction efforts in areas liberated from South Vietnamese control. Enemy sensors, once plucked from crash sites and studied with the intensity of religious artifacts, were now analyzed by teams of technicians trained in proper laboratories. The countermeasures that had been developed through desperate improvisation were refined into standard procedures taught at schools where electronic warfare was becoming a recognized military specialty. By 1974, the trail had become something its original planners could never have envisioned: a modern highway system capable of supporting the logistical requirements of conventional military operations across multiple theaters simultaneously. The bicycle pushers who had walked 20 to 30 kilometers per night, carrying 300 kilograms of rice, were now truck drivers, moving tons of supplies per trip on roads that could accommodate the heaviest Soviet and Chinese military equipment. The transformation was completed during the dry season of 1974 to 75, when People's Army of Vietnam forces began their final offensive. Tank columns that had been assembled in secret for years emerged from jungle concealment onto roads that could support their advance towards Saigon. Artillery batteries that had been positioned during years of patient preparation began firing from coordinates that had been surveyed during the height of American bombing. The trail had accomplished something unprecedented in military history. It had evolved from a guerrilla supply network into the logistical foundation for conventional victory while operating under the most intensive bombing campaign ever launched. The roads that had been rebuilt nightly by teenagers with shovels were now carrying the mechanized forces that would end the war. On April 30th, 1975, when Saigon fell to advancing North Vietnamese forces, many trail veterans rode into the conquered city aboard captured American M35 trucks, the distinctive smell of Truong Son mud still clinging to boots that had walked thousands of kilometers through jungle that officially didn't exist. A driver wedged a live python across his dashboard during the war. Military police waved the snake truck through checkpoints without searching, and decades later, he still kept a rubber snake in his taxi for luck. The Ho Chi Minh Trail officially ceased to exist on April 30th, 1975, when North Vietnamese tanks rolled through the gates of Saigon's Independence Palace. But the network that had defied the most intensive bombing campaign in human history left scars and stories that would outlive the governments it served, becoming legend even as its physical traces disappeared beneath returning jungle. In the immediate aftermath of victory, trail veterans found themselves struggling with a paradox that haunts all successful revolutionaries. The skills that had made them indispensable during wartime, moving invisibly through hostile terrain, rebuilding infrastructure faster than it could be destroyed, surviving on 300 grams of rice, and whatever could be foraged from the forest had little application in peacetime reconstruction. Many discovered that their war had been fought in a world that officially didn't exist. Laotian government secrecy meant that casualty figures remained classified decades after the conflict ended, leaving families without confirmation that their sons and daughters had died as heroes, rather than simply vanishing into the jungle. The Youth Shock Brigade members who had spent their adolescence clearing landslides found themselves middle-aged before their service was publicly acknowledged. The unexploded ordnance left behind by 2 million tons of American bombs continued claiming lives long after the last B-52 departed Southeast Asian airspace. Former trail workers, many of whom could identify different types of cluster bomblets by sight and had developed techniques for safely disposing of unexploded ordnance, found new careers in demining operations that would continue for generations. Post-war, these veterans planted cassava between rusting bomb fins and Buddhist prayer flags, transforming battlefields into agricultural cooperatives where farmers worked around craters that had become fish ponds after monsoon rains filled them. The landscape itself bore witness to the conflict. Perfectly round lakes where arc-light strikes had penetrated to groundwater, and geometric clearings where defoliation chemicals had prevented forest regeneration. The trail's engineering innovations survived in unexpected ways. Camouflage techniques developed to fool aerial reconnaissance, found applications in construction projects where environmental impact had to be minimized. Fuel pipeline technology refined under combat conditions was adapted for peacetime infrastructure development in terrain previously considered too difficult for industrial projects. Veterans carried psychological scars that peacetime society struggled to understand. Men who had learned to identify aircraft types by engine sound found themselves unable to sleep when commercial flights passed overhead. Women who had operated anti-aircraft guns while barely out of their teens discovered that the hypervigilance that had kept them alive during the war made civilian employment difficult. The cultural artifacts of trail life took on new meanings in peacetime. Songs that had been sung during night marches became folk music performed at veterans' gatherings. The improvised instruments, guitars carved from ammunition crates, mouth harps fashioned from truck springs were preserved in museums alongside AK-47 seconds and captured American equipment. Letters that had taken 30 to 60 days to reach their destinations during the war became historical documents, their mold-stained pages preserving not just personal messages, but glimpses into daily life along supply routes that had never appeared on official maps. Scholars studying these documents discovered details about logistics, morale, and survival techniques that had never been recorded in military reports. The bicycle reinforcement techniques that had allowed single riders to haul 300 kilograms of supplies influenced post-war transportation development in rural areas, where road networks remained inadequate for motorized vehicles. The bamboo and steel approach to strengthening vehicle frames found applications in civilian transportation, where durability mattered more than appearance. Medical innovations born from necessity, reusing glass bottles for transfusions, sterilizing surgical instruments in boiling stream water, using rice wine as anesthetic informed rural healthcare development in areas where modern medical facilities remained unavailable. Former trail medics became village healthcare workers, their wartime experience in treating tropical diseases and traumatic injuries invaluable in peacetime rural medicine. The trail's greatest legacy, however, may be its demonstration that asymmetric warfare could defeat technological superiority through human ingenuity and determination. Military strategists worldwide studied the conflict, drawing lessons about the limitations of air power and the importance of local support for insurgent operations. For the Americans who had flown hundreds of thousands of sorties against targets that seemed to regenerate faster than they could be destroyed, the trail represented a fundamental challenge to assumptions about modern warfare. Pilots who had dropped more ordnance on Laos than had been used in all of World War II found themselves questioning whether technological advantage alone could determine military outcomes. The trail endures in memory as something more than a military achievement. It represents the capacity of ordinary people to accomplish extraordinary things when survival and ideology align. The teenagers who had cleared landslides in pre-dawn darkness, the mechanics who had rebuilt engines from bomb fragments, the porters who had walked 20 kilometers per night while carrying loads that would challenge pack animals, their story transcends the specific conflict that created it. Today, portions of the old trail network serve as hiking routes for adventure tourists who camp in the same valleys where youth shock brigades once rebuilt, bombed bridges before dawn. The concrete bunkers and camouflaged fuel depots have become historical sites, their military purpose transformed into educational displays about the ingenuity of people fighting for causes they believed were worth dying for. The Ho Chi Minh Trail succeeded not because it was invulnerable to attack, but because it was more resilient than the forces arrayed against it. In an age of precision-guided munitions and satellite surveillance, its lessons about the power of human determination remain disturbingly relevant. Its true monument is not the scattered concrete and rusted metal that still dot the jungle, but the memory of what people can accomplish when they refuse to accept that their cause is hopeless, even when the most powerful military in history insists that defeat is inevitable.